So now we're going to go to a little bit of world history, which is unfortunately not the good type of history that we like to watch, but it's something that we should watch because, look, if you don't know about history, you're doomed to repeat it. And then after that, Matt is going to give us a little history lesson on what isn't covered in this video. So if you're only here for a bridge, that's perfectly fine, but I'm now going to watch something which is a little more informative and a little bit eye-opening, because after I watched part 1, 2, and 3, I went from being indifferent about whether or not Australia is a republic or a commonwealth to believing that I want absolutely nothing to do with the British monarchy, and I believe Australia should be completely separate from them, thus becoming a republic, because the way they handled the situation was disgusting. Simple as that. Simple as that. So I'm going to get started with the Irish potato famine. Number 4, we watched the first 3 already. I will edit them out, upload them on the reaction channel, and hopefully will get released. But we're watching number 4 now, which hopefully will also make it out. So let's get started, guys. Irish potato famine, number 4, the American wake. In 3, 2, 1, go.
Fiddles and song carry out the door of the house as neighbors slip inside to pay their respects. It's a wake. 2 sisters, girls the town has known their whole lives, will never more be among them. The neighbors approach the girls, shake their hands, and kiss them. For these girls are still alive. Yet by tomorrow, they may as well be in their graves. They've saved enough for the Atlantic Passage, and tomorrow will leave the town that until now has made up their whole world. This goodbye party is what's known as an American wake. Their mother cradles them, sobbing, knowing that when they disappear down the bend, she'll never again see them. In a time before photographs and telephones, she will have nothing of them, except perhaps a lock of hair and a fading scent on empty bedsheets. But still, they must go.
Oh, wow.
Irish immigration became a fact of life over a century before the Great Famine. But amid the horrors of 1847, it reached a fever pitch. That year, a stunning 214,000 people, out of a population of 8 million, left in search of a new life, where they could escape the hunger, disease, poverty, and surging violence. 1847 would prove the worst year of the famine. The British government had stepped up food aid, and private charities had tried to fill the need, but it was too late. Disease had taken hold. The economy collapsed, and the cities filled with starving refugees coalescing around food distribution hubs. The old bonds of Irish life, the family and communal village, were tearing apart as people sought a way out, even if it meant parting with those they loved. Irish living abroad in Canada, Australia, Britain, and the United States urged their families to come join them. Travel books began appearing in Dublin, laying out the different areas of Canada, where to settle, and how to get there. And people went. But the people who left were, by and large, not those suffering the worst of the famine. Ship passage across the Atlantic was expensive, and prices could fluctuate every hour. Generally, a ticket to the United States cost about £5, while passage to Canada cost $3. These were high sums, completely unattainable for those economically ruined or working for sustenance on the famine roads. Therefore, it was not the poorest who immigrated, but rather those who still had some means. Small farmers who could sell land and equipment, for example. Immigrants tended to come from communities that were hard hit by the famine, but not so desolated as Skibbereen or other areas in the West. There were, of course, other ways. Some landlords considered voluntary immigration the cheapest and most humane way to clear their land. One that, as a bonus, wouldn't put them under the threat of assassination in retaliation for evictions. They offered to pay a certain number of tenants to sail to Canada and found themselves inundated with applications. The truly desperate, though, found an innovative solution. They would commit a crime in front of a police officer, hoping that the sentencing judge would transport them to Australia. Actually, when a sympathetic judge moved to acquit a pair of women after one of these crimes, they just threatened to simply walk out of the courthouse and do it again. So, they got what they wanted. 7 years at a penal colony in Tasmania. But even for those lucky enough to get to a port, the danger wasn't past. Dockside con men fleeced the new arrivals, charging huge commissions for buying tickets or provisions. Some sold expired tickets, or provided ludicrous currency exchange rates. And then, a ship's departure might even be delayed, forcing prospective travelers to rent rooms they couldn't afford. As a result, many who made it to the port of Liverpool found themselves unable to afford passage and melted into the city's underclass. And all of this for space on a ship not meant to carry passengers. For the ships that plied the routes from Canada to Ireland were actually cargo vessels. They'd arrived in Cork or Liverpool, discharged their holds full of timber, and were hastily refit to carry Irish immigrants on the return voyage. And outdated British passenger laws mandated only 10 feet of space per passenger and 7 pounds of bread per week. The government knew these deficiencies were dangerous, but they wanted to encourage settlement in Canada. Tighter regulations would raise ticket prices, making Canada less attractive in comparison with the United States. The vessels on the Canada route quickly gained a dark nickname: coffin ships. The diseases festering in Ireland hitchhiked aboard, ravaging the passengers in the unventilated decks. Ship's crews, fearing disease, might keep the passengers as virtual prisoners below decks, and even refuse to collect the dead. One ship, the Agnes, left Liverpool with 427 Irish passengers. It arrived in Quebec with 150. That was extreme. But in the 1847 sailing season, it was not unusual for between 15 and 20% of Irish immigrants to die during the crossing. Those that survived languished on quarantine islands, unable to set foot ashore, while the disease spread further in the tent cities. Conditions were so bad that the Bishop of Quebec sent a letter to the Catholic Church in Ireland begging them to preach against immigration. Yet, they came anyway, and they made it. Thousands of Irish settled in Canada, with others walking south towards the border and crossing into the United States. Down the East Coast, things were no better, despite the higher ticket prices. It had taken many Irish refugees all they had in order to afford passage to the United States, and few had the funds to move inland once they reached a port. So people who had dreamt of farming in the West ended up clustering in cities like Boston, Philadelphia, and New York. And though generations of Irish immigrants had arrived before the so-called Famine Irish, the newly arrived often found that their predecessors did not welcome them. Those earlier waves of immigrants skewed wealthier and Protestant, and old sectarian tensions continued to simmer in the New World. Canadian cities in particular were known for brawls and riots around sensitive dates, like St. Patrick's Day and the anniversary of the Battle of the Boyne. And in both Canada and the United States, Irish immigrants, mostly Protestant, began referring to themselves as Ulster Irish, or Scots Irish, to differentiate themselves from the new underclass. In America, nativist societies sprang up, pressuring the government to cut immigration and contain the new Irish immigrants that they considered both racially inferior and religiously subversive. A fringe political organization called the American Party, widely known as the Know Nothing movement, arose to oppose immigration. And spinning conspiracy theories about Catholic plots to take over the United States, nativist groups formed criminal gangs like the Bowery Boys that harassed immigrants. Doctors, hard air quotes there, measured the heads and faces of incoming Irish immigrants, using pseudoscience to declare them racially inferior. Newspapers breathlessly reported on the crime, hopelessness, and squalor of New York's largely Irish-American Five Points neighborhood, making it America's most famous slum. And look, the 5 Points was horrible. Stately hotels became crowded tenements, their hall floors sitting uncleaned for so long that trash hardened and became part of the floor. In the 1850s, 55% of arrests in New York were Irish, and Irish women made up a quarter of the city's sex workers. Irish gangs like the Dead Rabbits clashed with the nativist groups like the Bowery Boys. In 1849, a dispute during a performance of Macbeth caused the state militia to open fire on the crowd, killing around 30 people. And in 1857, the Dead Rabbits and the Bowery Boys fought a citywide gang war that raged for 2 days. But recently, historians have found another side to the infamous 5 Points. A new study of records at a New York immigrant bank discovered that a sizable number of residents had 6 months to a year's worth of salary saved, a rainy day fund to get them through a crisis. Therefore, it appears that some stayed in the 5 Points not because there was no other option, but because the cheap housing allowed them to save more, send money home to family, and stay a part of an Irish community. And crucially, in New York, the Irish had a champion that would fight for them. John Joseph Hughes had been born in Ulster and found his calling in the church. Not particularly spiritual, but aware of the political power the church wielded, Hughes used his position as bishop, and later Archbishop of New York, to protect Irish immigrants and culture. In New York, Hughes saw a chance to rebuild Irish Catholicism, which was in ruins after centuries of religious oppression at home. And he began using the First Amendment as a cudgel, demolishing architectural laws that forced Catholic churches to look like Protestant ones, and argued against the Protestant King James Bible in schools. He founded Irish Catholic schools and newspapers, and during and after Mass, he ran classes on how to assimilate to American culture. And when he had to, he played rough. In 1844, a nativist rally in Philadelphia turned into a riot, with nativists flooding out to beat immigrants and burn Catholic churches. Shortly afterward, the nativists scheduled a rally in New York. Hughes visited the mayor and delivered a clear message. If one Catholic church was touched, the Irish were prepared to burn New York to the ground. The mayor canceled the rally. Other Irish moved west, into the coal mines of Pennsylvania and the gold fields of California. They worked construction, digging canals and laying railroad tracks, gaining a reputation for doing hard work well, finding their place in these new lands. And they kept coming, because in Ireland, blight had returned. The country they escaped would not see a full potato harvest until 1849.
So, the one thing that gets me is people talk about white privilege and the fact that people that are white have had everything handed to them, forgetting that, you know, World War I, World War II, and even during times of war and famine such as this, many people migrated and immigrated to countries with absolutely nothing, starting at the bottom, were taken advantage of, were treated as second-class citizens, and treated appallingly, and had to build from the ground up with little to no education, little to no support, nothing, and the laws were not in their favor. There wasn't even basic human rights, but then people are running around and screaming about white privilege. What exactly is it about? You've got Irish immigration in the US and Canada, where they were treated like shit, and you've got a lot of European migrants after World War II in Australia that were also treated like shit. Because at that time, anyone that was from Europe was considered, you know, a wog, and police officers would beat them up and jail them if they complained. They found no work except hard labor, building the streets, the railroads, you know, doing work that no one else wanted because they were uneducated and second-class citizens. And that wasn't even 100 years ago. That was 50, 60, 70 years ago. And these people came with nothing. So when people talk about things such as privilege, a lot of these people had no privilege. They had to work from the ground up. So it's not exactly accurate to say that just because someone is white, their family has handed them down, you know, wealth and knowledge, and it's just a ridiculous claim. It's a very ignorant claim that clearly shows that people don't know basic recent history if they believe that every white person is privileged because they are white. It is just ridiculous. Like, absolutely. I believe there is privilege, but it's not exclusive to someone that's white. Definitely not. Definitely not. Head measurements used to compare other races to animals as a way to call them less human. That is just disgusting. Hands down. Hands down. Dragon, first time managing to see one of the streams. Welcome, welcome, welcome. You just missed the Dragon Ball Z abridged part, and now we're learning a little bit about history. It's just appalling what they did. Just absolutely appalling. All right, let's take a quick 1 minute break, and then we will watch part 5, and then we'll have a discussion with Matt. I just need to get some water because my throat is hurting. I did manage to pick up the flu, so I am getting a little bit sick, but I will soldier on and hopefully not kill my throat. So let's take a quick 1-2 minute break so we can get some water, and then we'll continue with episode 5 or part 5, and then we'll take a little discussion with Matt as to the history of what's going on. But it's absolutely appalling how things were done. But history is something that's very important, and I believe it should be taught in schools. We need to be aware of history in order to tackle social issues that we're having today properly. We need to learn from the mistakes of the past, and as a society and as a world and as a species, improve upon it. Because if we're ignorant to the past, we're simply going to make the same mistakes. And it's usually those that abuse power that are well educated because they use the past as a way to hone power. Whereas the masses remain ignorant and they just fall into the same traps. Good night, Jet. Thanks for coming. And thanks for the links and all the help. So I'll be back in 2 minutes and we'll continue.